I never thought the quiet land I'd worked for decades would betray me with silence, so heavy it felt like a warning. The sun was already leaning west, the kind of red sky that makes you think the day is bleeding out. I was riding the fence line when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a pile of rags caught against the rocks, something the wind had carried too far. But then the rags moved, and I realized it was a body. A woman's body. She was lying half in shadow, half in light, her skin pale like the desert had already claimed most of her. Her dress was torn, dirty, blood seeping through in places I couldn't name. She didn't look alive, not really. And yet, as I got closer, I saw the faint rise of her chest. Breathing. Barely. I'd seen death before, more times than I cared to count. The war taught me too much about broken bodies, and ranch life had only added to that lesson. But this was different. This wasn't a soldier or an accident. This was cruelty, deliberate and raw, written into her skin like someone had carved their hate into her flesh. For a moment, I froze. The land around me was still, like even the birds had gone quiet. I knew that if I turned away, no one would ever know she'd been here. The dirt would drink her blood, the coyotes would take the rest, and the world would forget her. But I couldn't. Something in the way her hand twitched, weak and trembling, like even dying she was still fighting, chained me to her. So I lifted her up. She weighed nothing, like a ghost more than a woman. Her head dropped against my chest, and for the first time in years, my heart stumbled. I didn't know who she was or what kind of hell had chased her this far, but I knew one thing. Trouble had just found me, and it wasn't planning on leaving. If this story already has you leaning in closer, don't go anywhere. What came next turned my quiet life into a storm I never saw coming. And it all started with that broken stranger in my arms. I brought her back slow, careful, the mare stepping like she understood the weight of what I carried. My cabin wasn't much. 4 walls, a roof that groaned when the wind got mean, and a fire that never seemed to last the night. But it was home. I laid her on the spare bed, the one I hadn't touched since my wife passed. For a moment, it felt wrong, like I was letting a stranger step into memories I'd sealed shut. But the sight of her, torn apart and clinging to life, silenced that guilt. I cleaned her wounds with what little I had. Old war tricks came back to me. Boiling cloth, using whiskey when water wasn't enough, binding cuts tight so blood stayed where it belonged. She didn't stir much, just small shivers that rattled through her bones. I could see bruises in colors no one should wear, her face hollow, her lips cracked. That night I sat by the fire, watching her chest rise and fall. I should have been relieved she was still breathing, but instead I felt unease crawling under my skin. A man doesn't end up in this kind of state without someone putting her there, which meant whoever had done this wasn't far. And the way the wind scraped against the cabin walls, it felt like the land itself was warning me. Danger wasn't behind me. It was already on its way. By morning she was still alive, though barely. Her eyes cracked open once, cloudy and lost, like she was staring through me at something I couldn't see. I tried to offer broth, lifting her head slow so she wouldn't choke. She swallowed, then sank back down, her breath rasping like sand dragged across stone. She hadn't spoken yet, but fear clung to her even in sleep. She flinched at shadows, tensed at every creak of the cabin, like the darkness itself was chasing her. I'd lived years in silence, fixing fences, tending cattle, burying grief where no one else could see. But now my cabin was no longer mine. It felt like the air itself had shifted when I brought her inside. Every corner whispered questions I couldn't answer. Who was she? What had been done to her? And worse, what had followed her here? I stepped outside for wood, and the land felt wrong. Too still. The kind of stillness that means something's watching. I'd felt it before, on battlefields, right before the first shot cracked the air. The world holding its breath, waiting for blood. That's when I knew her arrival wasn't accident. She hadn't just stumbled across my land. She'd been left here. Left for me to find. And a man doesn't abandon a broken woman at the edge of another's ranch unless he's sending a message. She woke proper on the second day. Her voice was broken, dry as old timber, and when she tried to speak the sound barely made it past her lips. I didn't ask questions. A man learns, after enough years of loss, that silence can heal more than words. So I listened. She said fragments at first, nonsense almost, but then one word came clear, sharp as a knife: fear. The way she whispered it, like it had been carved into her, told me enough. I let her rest, but I couldn't rest myself. My cabin was too small for both her ghosts and mine. I kept thinking of the tracks near the fence line, the faint marks in the dirt I'd noticed before the wind took them. Someone had come close, too close, and it wasn't by chance. The more I thought on it, the clearer it became. Whoever hurt her had wanted her found. Not by just anyone, but by me. And that truth crawled under my skin like fire ants. I went to the barn that evening, sharpening tools that weren't meant to be weapons, but would do if trouble came. The horses shifted uneasy, ears pinned back, like they felt the storm brewing same as I did. When I returned to the cabin, she was sitting up, weak but steady, wearing the quilt I'd draped over her shoulders. Her eyes followed me across the room, searching, almost asking if she could trust me. I didn't say a word. I just lit the fire, sat in my chair, and kept watch. Because I knew trust wouldn't be enough to keep us safe. By the third night she found her strength to speak more than a word. It wasn't a story she gave me, not clean or ordered, just broken pieces of memory spilled like glass across the floor. I gathered them the best I could, careful not to cut myself on the sharp edges. There was a man, always the same man, his shadow long over every word she whispered. She never named him, not at first, but the way she trembled told me his name carried weight heavy enough to crush her. She spoke of nights without sleep, of running through brush with nothing but the clothes on her back, of hiding in barns that didn't belong to her, praying the dogs wouldn't catch her scent. She told me how she had tried to leave before, how every road she took seemed to circle back to him, like he had the land itself working against her. And the bruises on her skin, those weren't the first. They were only the latest. I listened, though every word was a stone dropped in my gut. I had lived most my life avoiding the fights that weren't mine, kept my head down, let neighbors settle their own troubles. But this was no neighborly quarrel. This was rot, the kind of evil that doesn't stop until someone makes it stop. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside, the coyote's cry, the branches scraping the roof, even the shifting of the wind, felt like a signal. I sat by the fire with my rifle across my knees, staring at the door, because sooner or later, the man she ran from would come looking. And when he did, he'd find her here. And that meant he'd find me too. Dawn came heavy that morning, the kind that turns the horizon to copper and sets every shadow on edge. I'd been up long before the light, boots on, fire low, waiting for something I couldn't name. She stirred in the back room, her movements stronger now, and when I brought her water she held the cup herself. Her hands shook, but she managed. Progress, though her eyes still carried that faraway look, like part of her hadn't yet returned from wherever she'd been forced to go. As the day stretched, I busied myself with chores, mending a gate, feeding the horses, hauling wood, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought. Why here? Of all the places she could have been left to die, why the edge of my land? That question gnawed at me until I realized the answer was plain. Whoever wanted her gone also wanted me tangled in it. And maybe worse, they knew I wouldn't walk away. By afternoon, Signs began to show. Hoof prints near the creek that weren't mine. A cigarette but ground into the dirt by the south fence. Fresh enough the tobacco still carried scent when I bent to pick it up. Someone had been watching. Maybe still was. My stomach tightened, but I didn't tell her. No use piling more fear onto the mountain she already carried. Instead, I kept the rifle closer, leaned it against the wall where my hand could find it in an instant. That evening, she stepped outside for the first time, wrapped in my late wife's shawl. The air was cool, carrying the smell of pine and distant rain. She stood there long, breathing it in, as if trying to remind herself that the world still had places untouched by cruelty. Watching her, I felt something stir in me I thought was buried for good. Not love, not yet, but the fragile start of hope. Still, I couldn't shake the truth. Hope wouldn't be enough when the man she feared finally showed his face. The first real sign of him came 2 nights later. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the scent of smoke from somewhere far off. I was sitting near the fire, her in the back room asleep, when the dogs started barking. Not the restless kind, but sharp and urgent, their voices cutting through the dark like knives. I stepped outside with a rifle, the cold biting my face, and that's when I saw it. Horse tracks leading straight up to the tree line, fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth. Whoever it was hadn't come close enough to show themselves, but close enough to let me know they'd been there. A warning. I didn't sleep after that. Sat in the chair by her door, boots still on, listening to every creak of the cabin. By morning, the tracks had already dried hard, the kind of evidence the wind couldn't erase fast enough. When she woke, I caught the way she looked at me, like she already knew. She didn't ask if someone was out there. She didn't need to. Fear lived in her bones too deep for me to hide the truth. Later that day, she finally told me his name. She said it quiet, but it still filled the room like thunder. I'd heard of him before. Most folks in the county had. A man known more for the things never proven than the ones he was caught doing. Land disputes that ended with neighbors gone, debts that disappeared when men turned up missing, whispers of cruelty that no one dared speak aloud. And now I knew his cruelty had a face in front of me, bruised and broken but still breathing. That night, as the fire burned low, I thought about all the years I'd chosen silence. How many wrongs I'd turned away from because they weren't mine to fix. But with her under my roof, silence was no longer an option. His shadow had crossed my land, and that meant his fight had become mine. It was late afternoon when he finally came. The sun was still high, burning the dirt into stone, and I was working on a broken hinge out by the chicken coop. I heard the hooves first, slow, deliberate, like each step carried a promise. I straightened, rifle leaning against the fence, and watched as he rode into view. Broad shoulders, a scar that cut across his jaw, and eyes that scanned my land as though it already belonged to him. He didn't dismount at first, just sat tall in the saddle, studying me the way a wolf studies its prey. Behind him the dust settled heavy. No deputies, no law, no one else. He didn't need anyone. His kind carried power in the fear they sowed. Finally, he swung down, boots hitting the dirt with a weight that seemed to shake the ground. I didn't move. Neither did he. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the space between us filled with heat and silence. Inside the cabin, I knew she was watching from the window. Her presence pressed against me like a second heartbeat, though she didn't make a sound. And maybe that was what kept me steady, the knowledge that she trusted me to stand between her and the devil who had carved her down to nothing. He walked closer, slow, like he had all the time in the world. His hand rested near his belt, not on the gun, not yet, but close enough to remind me he didn't come to talk. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with the kind of resolve a man finds when he's got nothing left to lose but his own soul. That was the moment I understood. There would be no peace, no running, no turning away. This man hadn't just come for her. He had come for me too, to prove my land, my silence, my very life could be broken the same way he had broken hers. And I'll tell you this. He was about to learn that some men might bend under loss, but when they finally decide to stand, they don't break. He didn't give a warning. 1 second he was standing there, the next he lunged, arm raised, a swing meant to crush. I caught his wrist midair, twisting it back in one clean motion I hadn't thought I still remembered from the old army days. The sound of his bones cracking was quiet, but enough to make even the horses startle. He stumbled, cursed under his breath, and for a moment I saw the disbelief in his eyes, the kind that only comes when a man realizes the fight isn't as easy as he thought. She stepped out then, not with a weapon, not trembling or hiding, but with something I hadn't seen in her before, steel. Her eyes met mine, and I knew we weren't just fighting for her life anymore. We were fighting for the right to hold this ground, to reclaim what he thought he could take. He glared at her, fury twisting his face, but she didn't flinch. Not once. The neighbors had started gathering, drawn by the commotion, the sounds of struggle, the tension in the air. I could feel their eyes on us, some hesitant, some angry, some scared. But none dared step forward yet. This wasn't their fight. Not yet. I didn't say anything. My hand stayed firm on his wrist, forcing him back, controlling the moment. He tried to free himself, struggled with all the power he had, but strength without purpose is nothing. And he had purpose, but we had justice. By the time he backed off, muttering threats and swallowing his rage, the balance had shifted. The dust he left behind swirled in the evening light, and I looked at her, her chest rising steady now. No tears, no panic, just a woman reclaiming what had been stolen from her. It wasn't over. I knew it. He would be back. But that night, for the first time, we had proven something. He wasn't untouchable. And she wasn't helpless. He came back 2 days later, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 men rode behind him, faces hardened by the same cruelty he carried like a brand. Dust rose under their hooves like smoke from some unseen fire. I saw them coming long before they reached the fence line, and I didn't panic. I didn't need to. I had years of solitude to prepare me, and nights of watching over her had sharpened every sense I had left. She was inside, peeking through the curtain, hands clenched tight, but she didn't step back. Not this time. When they stopped a few yards from the porch, he barked his claim. She was his, and I had no right to shelter her. The words were empty, dangerous, and carried the weight of a threat that had haunted her for years. I stepped forward, letting the rifles I had stashed lean against the porch. I didn't raise them yet. I didn't need to. My voice, low and steady, carried the warning he'd ignore at his own peril. Leave now, or pay the cost. They laughed at first. Not the kind of laughter that carries joy, but the kind that thinks power is all that matters. But I had no intention of letting fear dictate this land or her life. Behind them, the sheriff appeared, rifle slung, deputies at his side, and the balance shifted before their eyes. Evidence had been found the night before, bones buried beneath the old well, proof of the crimes they thought could stay hidden. Silence had ended, and law had arrived, steady and final. He froze. For the first time, the arrogance left his face, replaced with uncertainty and the realization that the days of terror had ended. The men with him faltered, the threat that had been so sharp just hours before dulled in the presence of something greater than him. Justice. When the sheriff read the charges and clapped the cuffs on, I saw the years of fear in her eyes start to lift. We didn't celebrate. Not yet. The dust settled slowly, neighbors watching with cautious relief, knowing they'd witnessed the first chapter of what freedom looked like. And in that quiet, I realized something I hadn't felt in decades. Maybe the worst of the storms could end, and the land, along with the people it sheltered, could begin to breathe again. The sheriff rode off with Earl and his men, the dust settling like a curtain falling after the storm. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the ranch was still. Not empty, not silent, but quiet in the kind of way that lets you notice the wind through the cottonwoods, the smell of earth after rain, the gentle movements of horses grazing. I stepped onto the porch, looking over the land I had fought to protect, and she was behind me, slow, deliberate, walking into the yard without fear. She didn't speak at first, just let the sunlight catch her face, her hair tangled but free, her posture steady. We didn't need words. The land had held enough of our story already, the echoes of fear and the weight of survival hanging in the air. I watched her bend down to help a mare with a nervous start, her hands soft, patient, coaxing trust where it had been broken. It reminded me of what had drawn me to her in the first place, not just the need to protect, but the ability to rebuild, even from the ruins. Days turned into weeks. She stayed, not because she had to, but because she chose to. We tended the ranch together, small routines replacing fear, feeding the chickens, stacking hay, patching fences. And every evening she walked behind the house to the cottonwood tree, sometimes sitting in quiet reflection. I respected her space, never intruding, because I understood now that healing is something that cannot be rushed or forced. One afternoon, she returned from her walk with a single wildflower. She held it out to me, and for a moment I thought about the wife I'd lost, the daughter I'd buried, and the decades of silence that had kept my heart boxed away. She said quietly, almost like a prayer, "I hope she wouldn't mind me being here." I smiled and told her, "She would have liked you." That was all. No grand statements, no forced emotion, just acknowledgement, the kind that carries more weight than any words could. Sometimes I still watch her with the mare, or see her smile at the chickens, and I realize that the broken pieces of both our lives are slowly being stitched together. The ranch still creaks, the wind still carries warnings, but now there's a rhythm of trust, patience, and quiet strength. And I know that some storms leave behind more than destruction. They leave a space to rebuild, a chance for life to grow again. If you've been holding your breath through this story, wondering how fear can turn to courage, and how silence can turn into justice, take a moment to reflect. Maybe share this story with someone who needs to see that even in the darkest moments, standing up, speaking out, and simply staying can change everything. And maybe, just maybe, today is the day someone finds the courage to begin again.